Hello and welcome to this very special broadcast, the Budget Roundtable. Budget 2023 around the corner, and it's time to take a look and take stock of what are the challenges and what are the opportunities before India. We all know we are running into the election year, and this is going to be the last complete budget that is going to be unveiled by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. How much is going to be really pointed out towards the elections of 2024? How much is going to take a look at the long-term requirements of the economy at a time when we are looking at doom and gloom across the world is anybody's guess, and that's what this budget is going to be judged on. We have several challenges given the state of the world economy, recession staring hard at most of the G20 nations, private investments in India still not quite taking up, unemployment still a huge challenge, saving rates in households going down, the subsidy bill ballooning given the COVID years just gone by. But even as we look at these challenges, there are several opportunities that still do exist for India. For example, India has been called the global bright spot. And if the world feels that way, why does it feel that way? The fact that we've managed our COVID situation well, the fact that government's capital expenditure is up, the fact that we have a big market are all factors that go in support of India. And today we'll look at all of this in the backdrop as we introduce to you head honchos of corporate India. Joining me tonight, Mr. Subrakant Panda, President of FICCI and MD of Indian Metals and Ferroalloys Limited, joining me live. Mr. Sanjeev Mehta, immediate past President of FICCI and CEO and MD of Hindustan Unilever Limited, also President of Unilever South Asia. Also joining me tonight is Mr. Uday Shankar, past President FICCI and founder of Marigold Park Capital Advisors Private Limited. I'll begin with you, Mr. Uday Shankar. Given the fact that you've worn a journalistic hat in the past and today you're one of the leading lights of corporate India, I want to look at it really from a political economy perspective. It is a budget year and a budget, it's a last full budget that will be presented by this government ahead of elections of 2024. What do you think is going to be the agenda, and will they be really taken away with populism at this point in time, or will they have a balanced and a budget looking at long-term vision?
Thank you, Navika, first of all, for that very flattering introduction. But to answer your point, I think you've said a lot of it in your introduction yourself, that it is a year of amazing global challenges of the kind that we haven't seen in a couple of decades. The world isn't used to dealing with this level of macroeconomic, geopolitical, and other kinds of challenges. But it's also the opportunity of India for India, and I think it's India's moment to lose, and the government is very seized of it. Coming to the point of populism versus a balanced budget, I think the government has been very clear and consistent. Prime Minister Modi has been very clear and consistent over his entire tenure that the government needs to work consistently, not just during elections, but consistently on two fronts, making sure that the growth is driven very strongly, the country grows, the economy grows, and wealth is created. But simultaneously, every year, the government has been very focused on making sure that the benefits of that growth, the fruits of an expanding economy are delivered to the underprivileged section. So I don't think you will see a major departure in the budget because it is the last budget before a general election. One, the popularity of the government remains very high. The Prime Minister's popularity remains totally unaffected, as high as it was in 2014, 2015. So I don't think the government is under pressure to do things that it hasn't done to win an election. And secondly, the government has it's probably the first government that we see which is extremely clear that it has to work continuously, not just every year, but every quarter and every day of the quarter to deliver benefits on both fronts.
That's very well said. But Mr. Sanjeev Mehta, let me ask you, the fact is that unemployment remains a challenge. There are headlines that make news virtually every other day globally about layoffs, and India is no different. The fact that government debt has increased, the fact that we do have challenges in terms of growth, the growth forecast being revised downwards by Moody's to about 5.6, which was 6.5, a few months ago. In the middle of all of this, how do you expect the government to look at the top line, both politically as well as financially, keeping a sound budget and a sound vision up ahead of everybody?
Yeah, thank you, Navika. Let me just take you a step back. 2 years back, in the thick of the pandemic, when Madam Sitaraman unveiled her budget, her focus was primarily in what we call as the 3 Rs: the recovery of the economy, the relief for the stress, and the reforms. And 2 years down the road, I would like to believe that the government is not going to veer away from these fundamentals. And if we look at our track record today, we are talking about this year delivering about growth in the vicinity of 7%. Even the inflation is going to be in the vicinity of 7%, the magical 7. And you did allude to that the growth numbers have come down, the forecast by IMF World Bank for 23. Now, let me remind you that not just India's number, but the global growth number they are forecasted is somewhere in the vicinity of 1.3%, which is going to be the lowest in the last 3 decades. Amongst the third lowest in the last 3 decades. One happened during the global financial crisis. One was during 2020 when the pandemic happened, and this is the third time. In that context, India growing in the vicinity of 6% would be a great achievement. The second thing you were talking about that the India's debt has gone up. Let me tell you, India's debt to GDP, which was at 90 odd percent, the government debt has now come down to about 80%. We often forget that when you really have to look at the debt of the country, you also have to take into account the private sector debt. India's private sector debt, which is in the 50s, is significantly low than, say, China, the US, which are over 200%. So I don't think our fundamentals are bad today. Look at the kind of capital expenditure that the government is budgeted in the last budget, and they are in line to deliver that expenditure, 7.5 lakh crores. And all this augurs well. Today, we don't talk about the twin balance sheet problem at all. The banks have been recapitalized. The corporates have deleveraged. I think we are in a very sound position from a macroeconomic perspective.
Okay, that does give a sense of hope. But Mr. Panda, how do we look at this budget? While we are saying the fundamentals are strong, capital investment by the government has taken up, the private sector hasn't really kept pace in terms of investments. Also, look at the stock markets. FIIs have been pulling out bit by bit. My question to you is, when you look at an economy like India, exports, if the recession fears across the world are to be believed, will India be untouched? The fact that we have a large subsidy bill, will that allow us any leg room for developmental and infrastructure investment? Will the finance minister be looking at some of the headlines? And remember, politics cannot be delinked from economics in a practical world. She will have to look at the tax slabs. Corporate taxes were addressed, but Personal income tax limits have not been addressed. Do you think some of these factors will weigh on the finance minister's mind?
Thank you, Navika, and thank you for having my colleagues and I from FICCI on this show to talk about budget expectations. Let me start with talking a little bit about how we got here in the first place. And I think India has generally done well, played its card well during the pandemic to both in terms of the quantum and timing of the stimulus, which means that we have actually, and most importantly, I think the focus on reforms, which has put us in a good situation. But having said that, we are clearly not decoupled from the rest of the world, and you're absolutely right that there are challenges before us. Because again, as Sanjeev briefly mentioned, about I think 1/3 of the world's economy is facing recession, and even though we will, I think, do very well in terms of growth, relatively speaking. But I think it is very important to keep a watch on developments around us. Now, some of the issues that you referred to, and let me try and answer those questions. First and foremost, in as much as private sector capex is concerned, you're absolutely right that it is still picking up. It has not got to the stage where we expect it to be. But I think that is still a sort of a carry-through of the pandemic period. But I must here commend the government for doing the heavy lifting during the pandemic and its aftermath. And I see this as a budget where you will sort of transition from purely or substantially government-led capex to private sector capex. And some of the data that I have seen shows that steadily, quarter by quarter, private sector capex is increasing. The announcements of new projects, new investments are increasing. So I believe we are getting there. But this, as I said, is a budget where we will see a transition from being substantially government-led capex to private sector stepping in and playing its role. Now, if you mentioned about the stock markets and FIIs pulling out money, I think that that is clearly a reflection of the US raising interest rates, the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and there is a flight to safety. So I wouldn't read too much into it because for every rupee which has been taken out by FIIs, I think there has been strong domestic support for the markets in terms of SIPs, etc., which are at record numbers. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. And again, when you come to a situation where the global economy starts to settle down, which is what I believe we will see certainly in the second half of the calendar year, I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of that money come back into Indian markets. But having said that, I think there are untapped markets where we can do better, which is Africa and the Middle East, especially with, for example, with SEPA being signed with the UAE. I think there's a lot of potential there to step up exports. And not to mention that service sector has done extremely well and is likely to perhaps cross the $300 billion mark this year. So again, I think undoubtedly we are in a situation which is challenging, but I believe India is as well prepared as it ever has been to face up to these circumstances and move ahead.
Well, so Uday Shankar, I would want to ask you, what are the 5 top things that you would be wanting to hear from Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman in this budget, something that will give confidence not just to the industry, but overall to everybody who's looking closely and waiting for this budget?
That's a very, anchor-like question, and I would try and not fall in that trap. Because I think, Navika, look, as I said, there is a level of clarity that I see in Prime Minister Modi's government that has been missing. There is the dual track approach has been very, very firm, and I will see that. I think it will continue in this budget. However, a few things that one would like to hear, as I said, that this is India's moment. Globally, the equity and goodwill for India has never been higher. I think India has emerged as a ray of hope. And this, India has often sort of flattered to deceive. This is the time when people actually believe that India is for real and India is there for a long time. And if we can just make sure that we unblock some of the issues that will allow Indian enterprise to take full advantage of that of these great tailwinds and great equity that India has generated, I think that would be great.
So, Mr. Sanjeev Mehta, manufacturing being given some amount of emphasis, PLI, the productivity-linked incentives has worked well, but has it worked fast enough? Has it really worked in a manner in which India can become a replacement for China as far as supply chains are concerned? That's really where we need to figure out whether we are or are we going to miss the bus again, and what does the government need to get there?
First, I think, Navika, we must be very clear that China is today an economy significantly bigger than us. And they are the factory to the world. So India cannot overnight replace China. I think we always talk about that there would be many global supply chains which would be looking at resilience, which would be looking at alternative to either to Europe or to China. And this is where India can step in. Now, India does need manufacturing and its share of GDP to go up from the teens to the mid-20s, because this is extremely important for us to create jobs. Now, for us to go on that line, we have to ensure that we are competitive on cost, quality, service, and innovation. Now, when it comes to cost, there is a benefit of scale. All of us in industry, we understand that. And PLI helps us to create that advantage in many sectors which did not exist. Now, PLI has just been introduced a year or two back. So we should not even sit on judgment. I think we should come and ask ourselves, what are the other sectors where we could be using PLI to help the industry gain scale? The other important bit is on, say, the innovations. And that to me is one of my favorite subjects, that India will have to go up the value chain when it comes to innovations and R&D. And this would require that we set up innovation clusters. This would require that academia, public sector R&D, private sector R&D, and the startups come together to create the ecosystem like we have seen, whether in Hsinchu in Taiwan or the Boston Biotech Hub or the Valley. Now, that's what we would have to do. The other important bit is we must understand that there is no country in the world today which is on the sweet spot of innovation where you're meeting the consumer needs at an affordable price and it is sustainable. Now, India can occupy that space, and that would enable us to take a big leap forward when it comes to manufacturing.
So, Mr. Panda, what is India Inc. looking for? How do you think this whole emphasis on manufacturing, scaling up, revving up private investment, how do you think this can be done through the budget? Most of the things these days happen outside the budget. But in the budget, are there any specifics that India Inc. is looking forward to?
I think first and foremost, what we expect the government to do is to continue the good work it has done over the last 7-8 years and take that momentum forward. Supporting manufacturing is what we are looking at very, very strongly. And I believe that can be done in a couple of ways. First of all, continue the focus on enhancing the ease of doing business. And in that regard, one specific suggestion we had made was to rationalize the TDS and TCS rates, because at the moment there are a lot of classification disputes, which then leads to unnecessary litigation. So what we have suggested, for example, is two TDS rates. It can be something which is revenue neutral. So we're not really recommending something in that regard. But if you put it down as one TDS rate for salary according to the slab that you fall in, and two TDS rates, and that would reduce the classification disputes and eliminate litigation. Similarly, in terms of attracting global supply chains, again, this is a once in a second time in our lifetime that we are having this opportunity of a China plus one. And we have to do everything that it takes to attract global supply chains. And in that regard, one specific suggestion we had made was about the 115 BAB provision, which is a concessional tax rate for new manufacturing entities, which was extended in the last budget by 1 year and is expected and will, the sunset clause is March 2024. Now, our recommendation is to increase that by a period of 5 years, because a large corporation sitting in the US looking to, or anywhere else for that matter, looking to move supply chains out of China needs that policy certainty to be able to take a decision. And doing this in bits and pieces, extending it by 1 more year and 2 more years later is not going to give that certainty. So these were the sort of two major suggestions that we had.
Well, Uday Shankar, you said it that the government is not under pressure, and it's carried on. The popularity in terms of the government as well as the Prime Minister continue unabated. Even then, you know it better than me. Politics will often have to look at some good news in the headlines. That's the way the cookie crumbles. What are the headlines? If you were to make, if you were to be running a television show today, what are the headlines that you would predict would be there in the budget? And now, wearing your corporate hat, what do you hope those headlines be?
I think the headline that you would see is that in an election year, government has focused to deliver on benefits for the underprivileged, but the government has not let go of the growth agenda. That is the kind of headline you will see this time.
Well, Sanjeev Mehta, do you think it's going to be vote over note?
I think the important bit is there should be a consistency of policies, and we should get into a stage where we should not be looking for big headlines in the budget. And I believe that the government, in terms of capital expenditure, in terms of providing relief to the stressed, in ensuring that the direction of the reforms continues, and there would be, yes, we have also had a very good tax collection. And, the fiscal deficit this year should be close to what was targeted. Next year, there should be a glide path because we have to be disciplined so that the cost of debt doesn't go up. And I believe that the government should be able to balance this. And it should be a good budget, which should augur well, and it should be in the direction which the government has set for the country.
Well, all very well said. But Mr. Panda, you know that exemption limits have to go up. It's not gone up for a long time. That's a headline that voters will be looking for. Do you think the government is going to be able to resist that compulsion?
Well, I don't think they need to resist any compulsion or fall into, give into any compulsion. I think the important thing is to find a balance. They need to find a balance between growth while also keeping an eye on inflation. Because keep in mind that inflation has come within the central bank's tolerance band after more than 18 odd months. But by no means is that battle decisively won, and we can't be complacent about that. So life is all about balances. I believe there will be a balance between growth and controlling inflation. And yes, I think you said it at a couple of points I wanted to make. One is that budget is a one-off exercise, but this is a government which really governs 365 days, and it's not. We shouldn't be looking at the budget only for big-ticket announcements. I think this is a government which takes steps as and when they are necessary and does it well.
Well, clearly, it is going to be Prime Minister Modi's vision and his formula, not just for elections, but also what the economy wants and needs at this point in time. And the key word that emerged from today's roundtable is balance. And it will be that tightrope walk of balancing all of these requirements of the economy that will be the task ahead of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. We'll leave it at that, and I hope you will join me post-budget to analyze how close we were to the predictions that we've made today in this budget roundtable. Thank you very much to you, gentlemen, for joining me on this very special broadcast tonight.